If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. As we've talked about, our attention is our primary productive asset. Therefore, we need to protect it. And today, we'll talk about how to do that in the face of modern technology. I'll describe the neuropsychological model of attention and how it gets abused by modern technology, and then what we can do about it. I'll say this is a critical understanding. Your productive asset is being hijacked right under your nose and used for purposes that you don't really care about and that are actually against your goals. And today, I'll help you figure out how to stop that from happening, what to do to help. This research is based on a book called The Distracted Mind, and that was written by Adam Gazzaley and Larry Rosen. They wrote it in 2016. And these are highly respected scientists, and I used them because I wanted to use the best source I could find for the information that we're going to deal with today. The book is about what does our ancient brain do with modern technology? And I'll break that down a little bit for us. The authors are a neuroscientist, a physical brain specialist, and a psychologist, which is all about how do we think and who are we as mental critters. So they joined forces for this book. They take an evolutionary model of the brain, which is our brains are evolving for some large number of years. We got here because our brains have been evolving for a large number of years. The reason that's important is because their view is our brains change slowly on evolutionary time. And we haven't had evolutionary time for our brains to adapt to the technological environment that we currently see. I don't love that particular line of reasoning. I like the science, I like what they're doing. But the whole evolutionary brain concept bugs me because there hasn't been evolutionary time for our brains to change to accommodate anything beyond walking upright. From my perspective, it's more a question of our culture, our social structures, and the fact that they've not evolved to adapt to modern technology. And that's what I mean when I say we're not culturally trained to deal with technology in the correct ways. There's still moving parts, and our training and social structures, which is to say our culture, has not yet caught up with it. For example, our culture has not yet caught up to the idea that we live in an attention economy and your attention is valuable and you need to protect it. The world knows very well how valuable your attention is, but we're not training our children around the value of their attention. And the culture, we don't have cultural mores or standards around this either. So I sort of agree with the author's argument, which is we haven't had time to adapt to it. And we need to hurry up and figure some things out so that we can adapt faster because we're currently losing. I don't think that the evolutionary timescale argument holds much water for me, but the end is the same argument. We need to figure this stuff out and we need to start working on it. And I've talked about this in other episodes as well. Here we believe, and you've seen this or heard it if you've been here more than 10 minutes, we believe that your attention is your productive asset. And I'll go further and say that the way information is presented is competing for space on that productive asset. Here's the image I want to give you. Back in the day when computers were hard to come by, we used to have to get time on the machine. We had to get it scheduled on the machine. Computers were big and expensive. Maybe you were at a university that had one. I'm going back to 1983 now. I was at school and they had a computer and we got to use it because we were students, but we had a very small time slice. Therefore, we had to get organized and schedule a time for the machine. Now, this is single purpose computing, and there was time for it to be devoted to what I, Larry, wanted it to do. And we could have these 15-minute time slices. Sometimes it was 20 minutes, but we could get time on the machine. So you'd either bring your program to run and they put it in the queue and punch cards and that whole archaic thing. So you'd go do your thinking and create your program and plan the things that you wanted to run. And then you create a cards and bring back that stack of cards, and they would run it at their time, which sometimes 2 o'clock in the morning, and they would give you the resulting output printed out on green bar paper. And then you go back and fix your program to do what you wanted it to do. And I know it sounds like Fred Flintstone uses a computer. And you're absolutely correct. That's the way it works because of the resource. But if you look at that picture, what we've got is a single tasking resource that's very valuable. And we have to be careful about how that single tasking resource is allocated. So this is the picture of our attention. It's a single threaded, single tasking asset. It's bound to some degree by time, and we can't replicate the asset. You can't replicate your brain. So how do we manage this situation? Well, the first thing that we want to do, just like those big old computers, the first thing we want to do is to not waste any of the single asset's attention or time resource. So the people who manage the computer wanted to book it and keep it booked. And this is a common efficiency model. If you have a bottleneck resource, and that's the computer in this case, or our attention, if you have a bottleneck resource, then you want to subordinate every other process in your factory to that bottleneck resource so that it's running all the time. And you want to also make sure that it's not running on bad previous batches. It's not working on waste product that we're going to have to throw away anyway. And it's not creating assets on the output side that are not immediately usable. So it's not creating inventory, it's creating sales. And that's this efficiency model of how to handle a bottlenecked resource. And that's the model of how our attention works. So we know that our attention is our productive asset because we're knowledge workers. And we take stuff in, we take information in, and we push information out. And so given that picture and that framework, how do we set that situation up in the world of modern technology? That is to say, how do we manage this bottleneck resource, our attention, in the world of modern technology? As we answer that question, there's going to be some takeaways here that are useful for you, recommendations on how to deal with the situation. But the bottom line is we have to manage our attention. It's a single-threaded asset, and it's our productive asset. I'll set the attention model up more thoroughly as we go. So we have to manage our attention, and here's how. As I've said before, we're knowledge workers and we live in an attention economy. Well, what does that mean? Economy. The word economics describes the study of how goods and services are produced and distributed, usually within a culture or a jurisdiction, a region, a country. Now, the reason it has a location, the reason that's important is because the same rules are assumed to be in place across the entire group of people who are participating in the economy. So, economics is the study of the economy. Economy is the noun. So then what economy means is this activity structure that allows goods and services to be produced and distributed. So When we think about the attention economy, we got to think about how our attention is used with particular respect to production of output. That's our knowledge work. Scarcity of the asset, that's our attention, and alternative uses that it could be put to. I'll say one interesting difference is in the modern world, our attention economy really doesn't have much in the way of location constraints. In part, that's because information moves quickly and cheaply. So I think for now, we can leave the location constraints out of our definition. There's still legalities and cultural things that come into play, but it's not really, the attention economy is not a localized phenomenon. But we do need to think about how our attention is utilized and how we use it to produce valuable output. And this will help us understand what do we do about allocating it. It's both scarce and valuable, and it has alternative uses that we could put it to. The question we face is, how valuable are those alternative uses, and how can I devote my attention to the most valuable of the alternative uses? And this is real life kind of economic analysis and how it's done. So we look at our attention, we want to think about it as a productive asset. And we use the term attention economy. For a parallel, we'll look at the factory economy, what it does, what are the productive assets, and how do we best allocate these assets. And for this, we need to understand how we assign work to our attention. How is our attention allocated in the real world? And that's why we need the model of attention. This model from the Distracted Mind book is the most current model I could find. I've actually looked for attention models for a while now and struggled to locate one. But this one seems pretty well accepted and up to date as best we understand the psychology and the neurophysiology of the situation. Now, this model has to do with three ideas. We'll talk about each one at some length, but I'll list them here to give you some structure for where we're going so that you can have a mental map for what we're going to do. So these three ideas. The first idea is selectivity. What that means is our attention has a property called selectivity in that we direct it. Okay, so that's one. Idea two in this model of attention is the idea of working memory. And I'll explain it, but for now, your general sense of working memory is probably fine. We'll tune that up here in a minute. And then the third idea is goal management. And that's probably not exactly what you think, but we'll get into it and explain. So these three ideas form the model of attention. These three ideas: selectivity, working memory, and goal management. So first, let's talk about selectivity. Selectivity is the idea that we can put our attention on something. If you're familiar with attention as a spotlight kind of metaphor, it shows this selectivity. And it's really interesting because our attention focuses on a thing or a situation or some other subset of our environment. That's this selectivity that we're talking. If we think, for example, of our visual attention, then the way our eyes are constructed and the way our vision works is we can see what's in front of us. We can see where our eyes are directed. We can see well there. And then in the periphery, we see less well. We have less acuity. And we can select our visual field. We can move our eyes to different areas of our external environment, and we can observe different things in that environment. And that's this notion of selectivity. I don't think we can zoom out very far and take the full 180-degree view. At least I can't. I can see some things, but it's really clear in a pretty narrow field right in front of me. And that's this spotlight metaphor. And I control the spotlight by physically moving my eyes and my head and my body. So selectivity. Now, the selectivity in our attention is both inhibitory and enhancing. So back to the visual example. Inhibitory means that when you focus your eyes on a particular object or subset of your field of view, your vision of other things peripherally is inhibited. We don't see that as well, so that we can selectively put our visual attention on the thing in the center of our visual field. The same thing is true for our attention mentally, our brain attention, as it is for our visual attention. The other word I used is enhancing. It's both inhibitory and enhancing. Enhancing means that if I direct my visual attention towards an object, I see it better than if it's not the center of my field of vision, not the center of my field of visual attention. We do it automatically with our vision, with our eyes. We'll stop glancing around. We call it paying visual attention. And we'll stop glancing around and look more closely at something or more intently at an object that's captured deeper interest. When we do that, it enhances our visual perception of the thing and inhibits our perception of the other things in the periphery. And that's the selectivity thing. Now, here, we've talked about selectivity. Here, I'll make the point that these things work roughly the same way, whether we're attending to things outside our skull or things inside our skull. What I mean by that is, with your eyes closed and utilizing only your mental attention, not your visual or other sensory attention, we can direct our attention towards an imagined thing that's going on in our skulls. And when we do that, just like with our visual attention, it's both inhibitory about other things and enhancing about the object of our attention. If you think about this really hard, it gets weird in a hurry. So don't think about it too hard. Just recognize what it is. And our mental attention to things internal to our skulls has the same searchlight, spotlight capacity to it. And that means we can direct it. We can tighten it. We can focus it. We can make it smaller, more intense, or we can broaden it out to a certain degree and make it more diffused across a bigger area. And the point here is that even if we're paying attention to an idea, a thought, or a mental image, we can direct that attention. Now, this is true. It's true mentally the same way it is visually, and it's true for selectivity, but it's also true for the other two pieces of the attention model that we're going to talk about. So it's true to things in the external world, and it's true to things in the internal world. That's the first piece, selectivity. The second piece is this notion of working memory. Working memory is particularly important to goal management, but it's also important to mental attention and attention in general. It's almost like there's a whiteboard inside of our awareness where we can put things, bring things up, or place things. And that's what I think about when I think of working memory. Now, one of the things that's interesting about working memory is it requires active maintenance. Now, this is from the book, but the book didn't actually say what the active maintenance actually is, whether it's just energy or if it's some other resource, but it keeps working memory refreshed from time to time for us. And one way to look at this maintenance is like an LED clock that's showing the time, showing the numbers. And let's say a clock that's showing 12:03 p.m. If we cut the power to the display, then it doesn't show that anymore. We're not maintaining that display. And that electricity is the maintenance of the thing that's showing on that screen. The screen's still there, it's just not showing. Now, it doesn't actually blink off, it just fades very quickly. And so that's an example of what this working memory sort of feels like. Now, again, we don't know what the resource that maintains it actually is, but it does mean that there's some sort of conscious control going on to maintain working memory. So I'll give you an example. If somebody tells you a phone number and you don't have a pencil and piece of paper, then while you're searching for a pencil and paper, you do exactly what everybody else does. You repeat the phone number to yourself. 555-1212. 555-1212 while you're looking for a piece of paper so that you can write it down. And that's this working memory. We're trying to refresh our working memory while we do that. I imagine people with a more visual working memory. Mine, to me, feels very audible. Perhaps they write it on their internal visual field, like writing it on their whiteboard. And instead of saying it over and over again to themselves, maybe they're writing it over and over again to themselves. Now, I don't know. But this is kind of that active maintenance of working memory. It's one way to look at it. So we need to maintain working memory. Again, it's a little mysterious how we do that. But the final piece of working memory is it's small. When we say our working memory is small, I mean relative to the overall capacity of our brain. We don't know exactly the size of our working memory because we don't have defined units to measure it. The rule of thumb is that our working memory can hold 7 plus or minus 2 things. It can hold from 5 to 9 things, varying from person to person and situation to situation. But when we say that, things is an undefined unit. So I don't know if it's 7 plus or minus 2 numbers or 7 plus or minus 2 faces or what, but that's the general rule of thumb. So let's take the high end of that, which is 9 things. Let's say our working memory can hold 9 ideas. I don't think it can, but just for the sake of argument, that's 9 things out of the total number of ideas that could be present in your brain at any one time. So it's 9 out of this very large number. And the point is, it's small. So the fact that it's small means we need to utilize it effectively. We have no choice. Now, in addition to just being small in terms of size, it also, you may have noticed this, your working memory does not have a history function. So there's not, oh, back. You can't do that. So it's not going to hold a bunch of different things at the same time. It's going to hold one thing. And this is part of what makes our attention a bottleneck and a constraint. Okay, and we'll talk about that bottleneck. So we talked about 2. We talked about selectivity, we talked about working memory, and now we're going to talk about goal management. In this context, goal management is the term for what we're attempting to do with our attention. Where are we attempting to put it and for what purpose? The core of this goal management is about switching our attention from one focal point to another. We can, of course, move our attention, and that's this selectivity that we talked about earlier. Goal management means that the switching is an intentional act, an act of our will, an act of our decision, and we control where our attention is, at least most of the time. So I'll get more into this later, but I think we sometimes overlook this in the modern world. I think between ideas about entertainment, discussions of attention engineering by Facebook and others, and this ongoing discussion of ADD and ADHD, I think it's easy for us to forget that managing our attention is a very human capability. I'll even go so far as to say, in some ways, this is what separates us from the animals. In particular, when we think about focusing our attention on purely mental ideas. So keep in mind that we all have this ability to some degree. Also, I think we can tune it up. I think we can strengthen it. In addition, through goal management, we look at this notion of switching cost for our attention. And the switching cost really comes in 2 forms. The first form of switching cost is this idea of attention residue. And it means if we're paying attention to something and we need to switch our attention, Our working memory is not erased immediately, but it dissipates relatively slowly. Our attention doesn't move on immediately and completely like a switch. There's still some lingering attention on the previous thing. So if we think about the whiteboard, maybe it fades instead of just being magically erased. And I think that helps us with this notion of attention residue. That's one form of switching cost. The second form of switching cost is that while we're switching, our perception is affected. This means between thought A and thought B, we don't perceive as well as we're switching thoughts. Our perception is less than it might otherwise be. It's decreased while we're switching between thoughts. I'll give you an example that may clarify this idea. You may know the idea of a saccade when we're reading. The image here is you're reading a book, these lines of words, and you're zigzagging across the page in this pattern. Well, what scientists have found out is that our eyes don't move smoothly through this, not continuously across the line. They move in little jumps, fits and starts, and these jumps are called saccades. The spelling there is Saccade, if you want to look it up. And that's a whole interesting thing in and of itself. But once they found this out, maybe the more interesting thing they found is that better readers have fewer saccades per line because they take in larger word groupings. So as we get better at this, we jump fewer times. The reason that's important is because they found out that while our eye is moving, this motion that defines the saccade, our visual acuity is terrible. We don't see well while we're moving our eyes. And I found that really interesting. So that's why it jumps and stops and jumps and stops, and is not just this smooth motion through the thing. Now, if you're tracking on a specific object, you've got good visual acuity on the object that's moving, but you have lousy visual acuity for the rest of the environment that's the backdrop that it's moving across. So the same idea. So we can't perceive as well with our vision while it's between saccades. So in much the same way, our perception is affected when we're between ideas. We don't have the perception, the perceptivity that we might normally have when we're switching. Now, fortunately, it only takes a little while, much like the saccades. So we don't notice it a whole lot, but it's there and it's important. So we don't see what's in between when we're switching between ideas. We jump from one to the next. In the Distracted Mind book, they have a running example when they're talking about goal management. This is goal management, right? They have a prehistoric human who's our hero, and he's George of the Jungle. They didn't actually name him. But George wants to get a drink of water. So he's headed towards the water hole. And the water hole is in a thicket of bushes and trees. And George is an experienced water drinker. And he knows that sometimes jaguars are near the water. Now, he's not sure. He's walking this direction. He hasn't seen a jaguar, but he fears there might be one because if there is one, then George has a problem. Now, George's goal is to get a drink of water. So as he's approaching the place where the water is, he's using his attention for a subsidiary goal, which is to look for the jaguar, to see if there's any indication that there's a jaguar nearby. So that's the subordinate goal. So the primary goal is to get a drink. Subordinate goal is to look for the jaguar. And so he's looking and he doesn't see the jaguar. So he decides that if he can make some noise, maybe this will startle the jaguar and get the jaguar to reveal its position if it's there. So you can imagine he's looking at a particular set of bushes. It's big enough to hide the jaguar. And he's using all of his different senses. He's listening, he's looking, maybe smell plays in. He's doing all these different things. But at least his visual attention is focused on the set of bushes, where if there's a jaguar, that's the most likely place. And he's hoping to see some movement over there. So he decides he's going to throw a rock, make some noise. So he kind of kneels down and he's still looking at the bushes. And then he just glances down quickly to the ground nearby to see if he can find a rock or something to throw. And he just glances because his hand is already down there. And he doesn't want to get caught by the jaguar while he's looking down for a rock. So he just glances down, his hand is there, and then he can move his hand around to find whatever it was he saw. So this is goal management. This is switching of attention. So he briefly switches his attention to the ground, switches it back, and then his hand is groping around for a rock while he's watching the bushes so the jaguar doesn't surprise him. So this is this goal management piece. The interesting part is maintenance of working memory. Well, one of the interesting parts is we can actually switch our attention, but we almost take that for granted. So the maintenance of working memory, what happens to his working memory while he's looking at the bushes? What happens to his working memory of the picture of the ground near his hand? He's having to maintain that. So if you're playing along while I'm doing this, you can kind of imagine he's got this mental picture of the ground on some sort of a screen in his head, and it's helping him move his hand. At the same time, he's using his visual attention to look at for the jaguar. Okay, so that's this goal management, this working memory idea. Now, I know that sounds a little bit like multitasking, but what's actually happening while he's looking at the bushes, his mental image of the ground is fading. And he's relying on memory, and he's kind of groping around with his hand. He's not moving his hand directly to a rock. And so he's got to try to maintain that mental image at the same time he's trying to maintain the visual image. He can't do both. Things are suffering here. Okay, his abilities are decreased in both instances. But there's another interesting thing that he can do, and it's because he's using his visual attention here. He can glance back down and refresh his notion of the ground nearby. Well, that's great if you're using your visual attention. If you're using your mental attention, there's nothing to look at to refresh the image. And that's why interruption in this mental space is so costly. Okay. We can do it in the external world to some degree because we can refresh our view quickly. And I think that's a really important concept when we're using these analogies to describe what's going on inside our head. So all of this, refreshing working memory, goal management, all these ideas work together to form this model of attention. And now you understand what it is. We give our attention to something selectively. Goal management has to do with what we select to give our attention to. While our attention is on it, we're using our working memory, and that requires some maintenance. Things switch slowly in the working memory, both because there's residual idea, the previous residual idea, and because our perception is weakened while we're switching over to the next idea. Oh, goal management is this constant switching of attention content and working memory to meet our goal for applying our attention to something. So we know that task switching is involved, and we know that there's a cost, and all of this stuff is this model. So the authors envision this attention challenge that we face as our tendency to switch our attention to another subject prematurely. One of the reasons that they wrote the book was to explore this premature task switching. And they believe that that's what gives us this frazzled sense in our heads of what's going on. So notice that they're not talking about any sort of syndrome, any sort of ADD or ADHD. They're talking about things that are boredom like. And why do we task switch under these circumstances? This is really interesting because we think about our attention and we think about the fact that it needs to be focused, but how does it get away from us? For the authors, it gets away from us because we imagine a more attractive, a better use of our attention. So Most people don't stop studying so that they can go read another book on another subject. They stop studying so they can go watch TV. And they're choosing a more attractive use of their attention, not necessarily more valuable, just more attractive. And so that's where all this modeling comes from. The authors of the book are trying to say, okay, what is it that makes us prone to switching our attention? So we'll address that. So given that model, then how do we manage our attention? How should we manage? And that's the whole point. Given the situation that we face, our brains work the way they work, and they're not going to change anytime soon unless technology intervenes. And I don't know where we're on that front. That said, our environment, our tool set is changing pretty rapidly, particularly around technology and the availability of information. Thus, the different uses of our attention and the degree to which our attention is hijacked or clamored for in the world. So the image that they want to talk about is if you're having trouble keeping your attention where you want it to be, then there are some things they suggest for you to do in order to strengthen your ability to do that, to keep your attention where you want it to be. Again, this is not ADD, ADHD. This is just standard model human mentality stuff. They do mention that a lot of this is, of course, related to devices like our mobile, because one of the reasons that we're more attracted to it is because it's always with us. We don't have to do anything. We just have to reach into our pocket. Used to be we had to get up, turn the TV on. So sometimes it made it easier to stay where we were. But right now it's just reach into your pocket, poke something, and there's something to occupy your attention. An interesting point, and this is almost as an aside, the authors mention the notion of a digital detox. And you may have heard this idea where you take your mobile and your digital apps and you turn them off for a week. And this is supposed to be training so that you become less dependent on your devices and apps. It's funny because the authors just dismiss all that with a single sentence. It doesn't work. They actually say it doesn't work any better than rehab works in other addictions. And I didn't know that rehab didn't work, but apparently that's what they believe. So it's the same thing. Now, what this means is we've got to have a more systemic intervention, that a occasional digital detox is not going to help us very much. They suggest some other things that we should do to strengthen our willpower, for lack of a better word, our stick-to-itiveness when it comes to this attention thing. Not in any particular order, but number one is from time to time, while your attention is where you want it to be, take a second and think about the value that you're creating, value you're gaining from having your attention where you want it. Think about the value of your attention where it is as you're studying, as you're reading, or whatever. From time to time, just congratulate yourself because of the value that you're creating. You're sticking in there. This is good stuff. I'm doing a good job. That's number one. From time to time, think about that. Number two is put the distractions away. And they are quite vehement on this subject. One of the big things that comes up in this book about, task switching in our attention is this whole notion of texting and driving. It's a model for what they mean by this distracted mind, because in their view, we all know that we shouldn't text while we drive, but all of us do it from time to time, and many others do it much more than from time to time, and we all know better. So their question is, why do we allow our attention to switch from the driving task to the texting task? And that's kind of one of the recurring ideas in the book. They say, in order to handle this particular challenge, put the distraction away. They say, if you don't want to text and drive, then when you walk to your car, put your phone in the trunk. And that's really interesting because on the one hand, that's a sure cure for texting and driving. If you don't have your phone, you cannot text. If it's in the trunk, you can't get to it while the car is moving. So you literally cannot text and drive. All done. You no longer have the option. The most interesting thing to me about this is that none of us do that. And I don't know why none of us do that. We get in the car and we go, well, I'm in the car. I'm not going to text and drive, but I'm not going to get weird and put my phone in the trunk. That's weird. And I'm wondering if that's just self-defeating behavior or if it's something different. I don't know. I will give you an example. You may or may not know that at one point in my life, I smoked cigarettes and I was pretty good at it. I smoked a couple of packs a day. At some point, it became important to me and to my wife, she smoked too, that we both quit smoking. The health thing got to be to a point where it was no longer ignorable, and we just sort of grew up and said, okay, we're going to take care of this. Quitting smoking is supposed to be this really hard thing, and it was. I had some fits and starts, and I struggled with it for a while. And then I finally realized that I didn't need to quit smoking. What I needed to do was quit buying cigarettes. And that's a whole bunch easier than quitting smoking. So here's my mental image. I thought I was supposed to have an emergency cigarette nearby just in case I was going to die of nicotine withdrawal. So then I'd wait as long as I could and I'd have another cigarette. Well, the best way to quit smoking is not to have cigarettes because then you'll quit smoking. There's nothing else to smoke. They don't grow on the ground. So that's the thing is put this stuff away. Don't have it around you if you don't want to use it. Put it away. But the most interesting thing is we don't do that. I didn't do it until I recognized the problem. We don't do it. We all know that if you want to lose weight, you put the fruit on the counter and the cookies in the cabinet. We all know this. And we don't do it. I don't do it. And I'm really curious about what it is about human nature that makes us do that. I find that fascinating. Another extension of this line of thinking is posts that you may have seen on visual clutter. People are like, oh, I don't know whether clutter is bad. If you don't want to be distracted by visual clutter, then don't have visual clutter. That's the simplest way to deal with it. Don't worry about being some yogi who can sit at the top of a mountain with his feet frozen in an ice block and not let it bother him. Move the stuff. Put the clutter away. So that's number two, is if you're afraid you're going to get distracted, put the distractions away. Where you can't get to them, then it's much, much harder to be distracted. So the third piece, the authors talk about this notion that we switch task when the current task becomes unattractive to us relative to the alternate task. And that's a fancy way of saying, well, we get bored with what we're doing and there's more exciting alternative. Now, there are other reasons we switch, but boredom will take the place of that for a little while. And we all do it. I'm tired of what I'm doing. I'll just take a break. We can do an interesting thing here. If we're doing these tasks that we know are prone to being boring for us, then we can enliven those tasks and make them more challenging, and that'll make them more interesting. An example, if you got to retype a text, maybe you work on your typing speed while you're doing this task. Make a game out of it. Maybe you work on your keystroke rhythm while you do it. Maybe there are other ideas, but add richness to the task to keep your attention on it. Try one finger per hand on your keyboard. Use a different keyboard. Use a different kind of keyboard. Find something. Maybe an on-screen keyboard. But this is this third idea. If you're doing this boring routine task, then try to figure out a way to make it a little bit harder to. This is one of the aspects of gamifying a task, is to make it more interesting, more exciting. So think about that as you're getting into these tasks that you're prone to switch away from. That's number three. Then finally, number four is a lot like number one. Remind yourself. Number one, from time to time, remind yourself that what you're doing is valuable. And number four is, from time to time, remind yourself that the other things you could be doing have more limited value. If you're reading your homework textbook and the thought occurs to you, well, I'd better go check Facebook, remind yourself at that point that what's on Facebook is probably not on average real high value for you. And then that goes along with, congratulations, you're sticking with what you're doing. And with all of these four things, we're beginning this cycle of building this attention muscle. So that's the four things that they recommend. I think it's important for us to know that there are ways to manage our attention given the model and the way the model works. And my own big takeaway from all this is we can get better at this attention thing. We're not victims. We're not enthralled at the hands of some overlord. We can do stuff about this and it'll work. That's encouraging to me. I think maybe to you, a lot of times we hear words like syndrome and disorder and the terms that get tossed around when we think about attention and we go, oh, well, that's some disease that I can't do anything about. Well, I might as well give up. Well, wait a minute. There are things we can do about this. We no longer believe, for example, that being out of shape is a disease. Being out of shape is not going to the gym. And whether you go to the gym or not is not the point. You understand and believe and agree with the notion that if you were going to the gym, you'd be in better shape. So you're not some victim about your shape in this particular sense. Okay. Maybe other areas of victim. I'm not judging anybody here, but we know we have agency here. When we get back to the model of attention, it supports this agency. I mean, there's nothing really wildly surprising in the model of attention. I mean, I like the fact that it was crisp and clean and well defined. They had thought it through very carefully and it's scholarly and generally accepted, but there's nothing real shocking in what they said. Therefore, it seems to me that the old advice still applies. The old advice is curiosity killed the cat. The old advice is focus on one thing, do one thing at a time. This is this old cultural advice that we tend to throw away in the face of new technology. I get it. I told my parents, my kids tell me, hey, you know, Dad, you just don't understand the technology, so you can't tell me how to react and respond to it. Well, right now, I say it's not that big a change. It's just another thing. What I mean by that is it has always been true that we could distract ourselves if we chose to. 50 years ago, if you were reading your textbook, there's 3 channels on the TV. And you could easily decide to put your book down and go watch the TV. It's no different. We think it's different. We think that because there's more information available, somehow it's more attractive to us, more dangerous. That's simply not true. It's always an alternative use of our attention. And I think this is the mindset that we need to fix. And I want to try to fix that here in this podcast because I think a lot of people get victimized, but I don't think we need to be victims. So, you know that old advice that I gave you. We know how to do this. It hadn't changed. We know how to manage our attention. It's the old-fashioned way. Our tools have not changed that. Our tools maybe gotten a little bit louder, maybe some more variety, but it's always been true that if you walk into a library that's any bigger than a kindergarten library, that you cannot in your lifetime consume all the information that's in that library. It's always been true. But we've never thought of libraries as information overload. Well, why is that? I suggest it's because in libraries, the books aren't shouting at us. They're not clamoring at us to pull them down off the shelves. Oh, read me, read me. They're very quiet and very orderly. And we're able to go in there amongst all this information and do what we need to do to find the one book we need to find. And we don't get distracted normally by all these other books because they're not shouting at us. Well, the good news is we have agency. In terms of the metaphor that we're in right now, when we go out into the library, out into the internet, these different sources of information are in fact clamoring at us. And that damages our ability to put our attention where we need for it to be. But, and here's the thing, we can turn that clamoring off. We can have the internet be just like the library. No talking, please. And then we can get on with what we need to do. We have an agency. Agency is exerting some control over the environment. And this is important because we need to know we're not a victim. We have agency. We can get better at this. Now, I do think that the book's recommendations fall short of the amount of action that's actually needed. These 4 recommendations are fine as far as they go, but it's hardly a solution to the problem. So I spend the time on this podcast trying to help you solve the problem. When I say turn off your notifications, that's the equivalent of putting your phone in the trunk. You say, well, Larry, there might be an emergency. I can't put my phone in the trunk. Well, I recall the time when there were no cell phones. And while I was driving or out of the house or whatever, I couldn't be reached. I trusted the people in my world and in my life to handle their own emergencies to some degree, and they did a fine job. Nobody died. So one of the takeaways is the ability to do something, the ability to use technology to remind us of things. Just because we have that ability doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. So we need to be constantly thinking relative to our technology. Well, you could, but do you want to? My offer today in this podcast is if you want more of this kind of thinking, this is episode 50. I think it'll publish as 57. And so there's other episodes that you can go in and find some more thinking about this. Go listen to some of those other things. Think about how to manage the things that are clamoring for your attention. And you're not too big or grown up or macho to need to turn them off. So as you're doing all this, let me know what you think. Let me know how you're getting along. Okay? You can reach me, Larry@dobusywrite.com. It's my direct email address. Or you can hit me on LinkedIn. Now, if you hit me on LinkedIn, tell me in the message that it's about the podcast, and that'll help me sort what's going on LinkedIn. So I look forward to hearing from you on this or any other topic. But just recall that you have agency, you have control in this environment, and you don't have to let your devices control you. The model of attention is your friend in this area. So we can support what we need to do using our technology in wise ways. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusywrite.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.